Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the hidden plumbing of modern civilization. We are tracing the global network right back to its incredibly chaotic genesis, a system built by two rogue Stanford engineers back in the 1980s.
Okay, let's dive right into this. To really understand the sheer scale of what we're talking about, we have to go back to the opening years of the 1980s. The computing landscape back then was essentially locked in a digital Tower of Babel. The microchip revolution had just happened, right? So localized networks were springing up absolutely everywhere. But as the source material points out, humanity had successfully engineered localized islands of intelligence, but completely lacked the unifying physical plumbing required to stitch these disparate networks into a single cohesive global communication matrix. Basically, if you had a network, it was totally 100% isolated from the rest of the world.
And the reason for this isolation was a massive tribal network fracture point. The market was completely divided into fiercely competitive, proprietary monolithic silos. An IBM mainframe only spoke IBM's language. A DEC minicomputer only spoke DCNet. Xerox workstations used XNS, and academics, well, they were just starting to play around with TCP/IP. These systems were functionally blind to one another. So to give you a real-world example, if a computer scientist in a university department wanted to email a colleague in the medical school, literally just 3 buildings away, the transaction was physically impossible if they used different hardware vendors. Honestly, at that point, you'd have been better off just printing the message out and walking it over. Simple departmental communication was totally paralyzed. Now, to solve this, you couldn't just rely on the old telecommunication giants like AT&T. Legacy telecommunications relied on hardwired circuit switching. That meant an actual physical copper pathway had to be dedicated exclusively to a single communication session from end to end. It was glacially slow and extremely capital intensive. It just couldn't handle the explosive, unpredictable bursts of modern computer data. The radical alternative, what would eventually become the Cisco paradigm, was dynamic packet routing. Instead of dedicating a rigid physical line, this approach broke data into tiny packets and shot them through a high-velocity, brand-agnostic mesh flow. But here's the catch. To build that high-velocity flow, someone had to actually, physically, splice the wires together. And that brings us to Stanford University in 1984 and an incredibly scrappy workaround. Leonard Bosack and Sandy Lerner, an IT couple running separate computing departments at opposite ends of the Stanford campus, were just fed up with the fragmentation. So Bosack took an experimental piece of microcode written by another engineer named William Yeager, stuffed it into a custom piece of hardware they called the Blue Box, and the couple literally went underground. In the dead of night, they crept through Stanford's underground steam tunnels, running miles of illicit coaxial cable to forcefully bridge the university's networks together. What they had hand-wired down in the dark was the world's first commercially viable multi-protocol router. This was a dedicated hardware bridge that could dynamically intercept, translate, and route completely conflicting networking protocols in mid-flight. Suddenly, these totally isolated networks could actually talk to each other. But Stanford University didn't see this as a massive technological triumph. They saw it as criminal insubordination. The administrative war got so intense that Stanford actually threatened them with intellectual property theft. Forced into a corner, Bosack and Lerner quit. They packed their hand-wired routers into the trunk of their car, incorporated a company named after the silhouette of the Golden Gate Bridge, Cisco Systems, and set out to sell this physical plumbing to the world.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer elegance of their commercial product, the AGS router. Let's walk through the routing mechanics step by step. First, an incoming packet of data, whether it was XNS or DCNet, hits a modular interface line card. Second, a central high-speed CPU slices open the digital header of that packet in microseconds. Third, their proprietary Internetwork Operating System, or iOS, translates the protocol on the fly. It is literally converting the language mid-flight. And finally, the data is forwarded along the absolute most optimized outbound geographic route. It functioned as a universal digital translator, finally unsiloing corporate data. So by 1987, this incredible technology had grown into a massive word-of-mouth phenomenon. Bosack and Lerner were bootstrapping the entire operation out of their home garage in Atherton, California, generating over $1.5 million in annual sales just using credit card debt and second mortgages. But there's a huge irony here. They solved a massive digital bottleneck, only to hit a brick wall with their own physical manufacturing bottleneck. The corporate demand swarming their phone lines was just explosive. To build the required infrastructure, they desperately needed institutional capital. And that brought legendary venture capitalist Don Valentine of Sequoia Capital directly onto the scene.
Well, bringing in venture capital created an intense cultural fracture, a real battle for the cap table. On one side, you had the founders' agility, this informal outlaw lab environment where employees brought their pets to work and customer service was, let's just say, chaotic. On the other side, you had institutional blitzscale. In 1987, Don Valentine injected $2.5 million into Cisco for a dominant 32% equity stake, and he brought in a seasoned, iron-fisted executive named John Morgridge to serve as CEO. Morgridge instituted rigid corporate controls and optimized assembly lines. The friction between the founders and this new institutional management was severe, resulting in some truly legendary boardroom shouting matches. This friction reached its inevitable conclusion in August of 1990, highlighting a brutal but standard law of the Silicon Valley scaling turbine. A founder's sentimental attachment to their technology is completely irrelevant to the venture capital machine. If the growth of the enterprise requires a transition from raw creative chaos to disciplined corporate scale, the system will ruthlessly evict the co-founders. And that's exactly what the board did. They executed a clean boardroom coup, firing Sandy Lerner. Standing in solidarity with his wife, Leonard Bosack resigned that exact same afternoon. $170 million. That is the staggering buyout number Bosack and Lerner received when they sold their remaining stake back to the market upon leaving. I mean, while the eviction was emotionally brutal for sure, that massive figure shows just how incredibly lucrative the transition to disciplined corporate management really was. They walked away from the valley forever, immensely wealthy. And with the founders gone, the velocity of the Cisco machine was fully unleashed. Under John Morgridge, and later under aggressive sales genius John Chambers, Cisco built a mass production turbine right as the 1990s dot-com boom ignited. Chambers executed a brilliant strategy called acquisition and development, or A&D. Instead of relying purely on slow internal research, Chambers weaponized Cisco's skyrocketing stock as a liquid currency, systematically assimilating over 70 cutting-edge startups. He stripped out their administrative overhead, plugged their tech straight into Cisco's iOS core, and dropped it into a global distribution engine. The results of this engine were absolutely staggering. Cisco's revenue scaled parabolically. Let's look at the timeline. In 1989, they were doing about $27 million. By 1995, as the World Wide Web exploded with the Netscape browser, they hit $2.2 billion. Every single corporation and internet service provider on Earth had to build physical networks to survive, and to do that, they had to buy Cisco routers. By the year 2000, revenues hit $18.9 billion. Cisco had become the absolute mandatory toll booth for the entire World Wide Web. And the financial markets rewarded that monopoly position wildly. In late March 2000, right at the apex of the dot-com boom, Cisco's market capitalization crossed $555 billion. This relatively invisible plumbing company temporarily surpassed Microsoft to become the single most valuable corporation on planet Earth. Now, we all know what happened to tech stock valuations shortly after that bubble burst, but the physical iron pipes they laid down, those remained absolutely vital. Every web page searched, every financial transaction executed was literally traveling through their network. And this brilliantly illustrates how that historical trajectory from the 1984 steam tunnels is completely unbroken today. As we moved into the 2010s, Cisco's high-density switches became the backbone of massive cloud data centers for giants like Google and Amazon. And today, we're pushing into Phase 7 AI clusters. Down in San Francisco's Cerebral Valley, companies like OpenAI and Anthropic are deploying massive neural networks. The aesthetic has certainly changed from illicit coaxial cables to pristine global cloud data fabrics, but the fundamental architecture of the network conduit remains exactly the same. So what does this all mean for us today? Well, the crucial point is this. The true limit of a modern generative AI cluster is actually no longer just the raw calculation speed of an individual NVIDIA GPU. The ultimate AI bottleneck is the massive networking interconnect speed required to link tens of thousands of those GPUs together into a single, cohesive, parallel computing engine. If the data can't flow between the chips instantly, the whole cognitive matrix drops frames and stalls out entirely. When you put it all together side by side, the evolution is wild. On one hand, you have the humble 1984 blue box routers from the steam tunnels, maybe pushing a few megabits per second on a good day. On the other hand, you have today's cutting-edge reality, ultra-low latency, custom chips, and 800 gigabit Ethernet interconnect fabrics. These modern switches are designed to blast literal oceans of token data across massive AI matrices in real time. It's the exact same problem Bosack and Lerner solved, just scaled up to the blistering speed of artificial intelligence. Which brings us to the end of our explainer and to a rather deep question I want you to leave with. As Phase 7 AI completely reshapes our future, generating art, writing code, and automating intelligence itself, who truly holds the power? Is it the visible cognitive software and the chatbots that we interact with every single day? Or is it the invisible, permanent, physical networking plumbing underneath it all? The foundational architecture that makes human and machine intelligence possible in the first place? Think about that the next time you send a single byte of data out into the void. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.